And I'd like to call up the panelists in order in your program, as you can see. Dr. Aubrey Johnson, the superintendent of New Brunswick School District. Come on up, please. And I'm the board president of New Brunswick School District, so I know he's going to say some great things. So, Kristen Martinko, a registered nurse practitioner with Prudential Financial. Matthew Redham, policy and practice coordinator, trauma-informed care. Clarissa Romero, the CEO of Mindful Consultants, there she is. And Dr. David Trout, a professor and founder of Rutgers Center on Law and Metropolitan Equity. Please give them a round of applause. Okay, before we begin, and I'm one of the co-founders of this conference, I had an opportunity to run an urban school in Trenton, New Jersey. And one of the things that I learned is that many of my students, I was 95% African American from Trenton, many of my students were dealing with trauma. And it wasn't post-traumatic stress disorder because it was continuous. And I actually facilitated a retreat for the mayor of Newark and was talking to Mayor Baraka, who was a former principal, and he's the one, I was talking about that, and he said, well, it's really continuous, Dale. So I came up with this new term called urban traumatic stress disorder, and actually wrote an article, and you're about to see a video that talks about some of the things that we did with that. So, Deepika, if you would run the video. If a child breaks their leg and we wouldn't expect them to run a 100-yard dash. Yet emotionally, many of our kids are broken and we're expecting them to behave normally.
Dale Caldwell coined a term, urban traumatic stress disorder, UTSD, to describe the chronic anxiety felt by inner-city kids. While we know the condition as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, common among battlefield soldiers, medical professionals say the condition hits very close to home.
We've heard directly from children. They've been shot at from distances like this, 3-4 feet, and that's perhaps even more visceral than wartime.
In Jersey City, 14 people under the age of 20 died from shootings or stabbings between 2009 and 2015.
But there are also instances where kids are the victim because they witnessed some things, or they're directly affected because they have a family member who basically was a victim of violence.
Well, so many of them are so concerned with surviving day to day, finding the next meal, not being yelled at, not being abused. There are gunshots in neighborhoods. There are gunshots on a regular basis. There are murders of relatives. There are family members. There's abuse that goes on. So all of these traumas, and at best, they're stress. Every child that lives in a poor urban community is dealing with stress. A few are dealing with real trauma, and that changes how they view the world.
Caldwell says it also changes their ability to learn, and 1 or 2 struggling kids can disrupt an entire classroom. He's brought 2 mindfulness experts to the Village Charter School in Trenton to lead 8th through 11th graders from the local Boys and Girls Club in meditation techniques.
What we noticed was an instant shift. They were, a little uncomfortable at first, and then as we went along, they were able to settle in and be more relaxed, and they were definitely reporting that they felt more calm.
Mindfulness is the practice of bringing attention to the present moment. Experts say it reduces stress and improves focus.
So at their age, they're very emotional because their prefrontal cortex is still developing, but when they practice mindfulness, it helps cultivate those neurons, helps those neurons become stronger, and it helps them build that area even faster.
And we've had a lot of the students who've gone through their sessions who said, I was about to get in a fight and I checked my breathing and it stopped me from doing it. And so it becomes a tool when they're in a tough situation to allow them not to react.
While Caldwell's term UTSD applies to inner city kids, he says programs like the one at Village Charter School in Trenton can be a resource for students everywhere, and for adults too. For NJTV News, I'm Erin Delmore.
I hope you liked that video and hope it opened some mind. You saw Clarissa as one of the stars of that video. So today we want to have a very real discussion, and again, we'll open it up for questions a little bit later. But this is a real issue, and I'll start with Dr. Johnson here, who ran the Patterson schools as the chief operating officer and now as a superintendent in New Brunswick. how have you seen urban trauma with kids in Paterson, New Brunswick, and elsewhere?
Well, let me begin. First of all, thank you, and I'm glad this is not a board meeting, Dr. Cole. You know, coming up, I'm a product of inner city. Grew up in Brooklyn, New York all my life. And, you know, in the 80s during the crack epidemic. And I seen and I was involved in a lot of things. But as I continued to grow and, you know, decided to continue my education because I had some guidance from a strict mother, you know, I decided to see a change through exposure, being able to go and travel abroad. You know, she was an educator as well. And I realized by having some type of exposure, when I came back to my community, I started to see things differently and I started to make different connections. But as an administrator, as a principal, I always wondered why on Mondays and Fridays, I always had a lot of extra issues. And this was just new to me. Like, why on Monday are all the kids in my office? And then why on Friday, I have all these kids again in my office? And it wasn't because it was Friday, time to go home. I started to realize there must have been something they were bringing to school, what happened over the weekend. And then also, by Friday, maybe they did not want to go back home or to their environments and started to act out. But we don't know this, I didn't know this, and I started to, you know, see this trend. It wasn't about specific students coming to my office from specific teachers. You know, I started to think it was just specific teachers. But as I continued to watch this, I saw this across all grade levels. So in speaking with Mr. Corwell and having the opportunity to listen to his study, I started to take a different approach. And just recently from the National Center for Urban Statistics, they have stated that about 51% of students that are in U.S. schools come from low-income families, which is what we call poverty in a you know, nice way. And understanding poverty, we also understand that there are some environmental stresses that come with that. Poor students, poor children, they do not have access, they have less access to healthy foods. They're coming from unsafe environments. Also, parents are stressed, just trying to make it. And they're feeling that. They're feeling that. In another study, I believe by Hagen and Here in 2015, I believe the title was Family Poverty Affects the Growth, developmental growth of children. You know, in this study, they found that, you know, they looked at students from 5 months to 4 years and looked at their brain development. And they looked at the effect of how their brain was growing compared to the children's experience to poverty. And they found that students that were poor, their brains developed at a lesser rate. And so I'm not going to get into the science. I think maybe you may be too. You know, there's a gray matter and the white matter in the brain, and the gray matter was developing at a significant lower rate. And in the gray matter, that's where you are looking for reasoning and taking actions or following through on actions. And sometimes I want to believe, I'm not going to make a joke on it, but sometimes, you told me to be real. That's right. Sometimes I wonder if I suffer from that. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm having a hard time at this time processing the information coming from the government. I'm also having a hard time taking certain directions, so I think we all suffer from that. But just to make, you know, this is not, I think this is really now a conversation about a biomedical condition, mm-hmm. An environmental toxin that's placed upon our young kids, but yet when they're coming to school, we have to educate them. Right. We have to find ways to keep them engaged, but also for our teachers to also understand this side. So I'll pause there.
Great, no, that's great.
Thank you.
We'll go, Kristen Martinko. Yep.
just to introduce myself?
Yeah, to introduce
Okay.
kind of your connection to urban
Sure.
trauma. Yeah, if you could talk a little bit
So
about that.
I'm Kirsten Martinko. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I work at the global health part of Prudential. So as the reason that we're on here is that we understand that these children that we're talking about are going to grow up and into the workforce. And it is very important to us that we understand that more than 70% of disabilities are invisible, just like we're talking about. And these people are going to enter the workforce, and how do we support them? So all of our programs are designed to affect physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, social, and financial health. And how that can look can be, very different. But every employee that enters Prudential is automatically enrolled in our behavioral health program, and all family members can be enrolled on, through our outside agencies. So we're very proud of that. We have social support. We have all types of counseling available, free. And we really understand that these people are coming to the workforce. People are coming with issues, and it's not just the right thing to do to take care of these people. It makes good business sense, because we want you to be at max capacity when you're at work. That allows you to work hard, stay, do your job, and contribute to our bottom line. So I'm very proud to be at Prudential, where we are a member of Newark, very proud, sponsor here, and we really do care about the community, and we truly care about our employees from all aspects of health. So
Excellent.
we do go out and we work with a lot of external agencies to ensure that these children who are growing up and that are going to enter our workforce, that we have everything we need to support them and all the invisible potential disabilities that they have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Matthew?
So we're going to be real?
Be real. That's why we're here.
Can you guess which guy's from the Bay Area? So, as you were talking, I'm sitting and I'm thinking about how a survivor of complex trauma. I also am a therapist. I've been working with kids and families with trauma for 17 years. And I work part-time in Oakland, California at Trauma Transform. So, we try to help systems to become more trauma-informed. The best way to explain it is there's a boulevard in Oakland, California. It's called MacArthur Boulevard. And you have a version of MacArthur Boulevard here in Newark. And every city in this country has a version of MacArthur Boulevard. And if you live below MacArthur Boulevard in Oakland, California, your lifespan is 12 years less than if you live above MacArthur Boulevard.
Wow.
And I want to ask a really challenging question. Do you think the people who live below MacArthur Boulevard look like me? No. And I also want to call attention to that fact too, that I'm speaking about urban trauma and I'm a white man. The reason I'm speaking about it is because I know a lot about trauma. I've lived through it. And I'm beginning to understand the differences that traumatic stress has on somebody like myself, and it has on a kid who first saw a dead body at age 5, who has to walk through a gang-infested area to get to school, whose heart rate is 115 beats per minute because their body has been sensitized to dealing with violence, right? So, when we look at the impact in what we call urban environments, I think the easiest way to say what we're seeing is that children are often being pathologized for the very behaviors that keep them alive.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So if I'm a kid and I witness domestic violence, I hear gunshots, my body figures out a way to survive that. If there's a fight between my parents, my solution is to get out. If I'm in class and the teacher is standing over me and giving me a consequence, my body and brain do not know the difference between that and what happened last night. So what do? I get out.
Yep.
And then I go to the principal, and then I get suspended. We deal with what we call, any departure from the norm in one of two ways. We classify it as being bad or being sick.
Right.
If somebody is sick, we take care of them to the extent that we disempower them. If somebody is bad, we lock them up. We are 800% more likely to incarcerate children in this country than any other industrialized nation. And those are the children we're talking about,
Yep.
right? Children who have PTSD, although only about 35% of kids who have 4 or 5 adverse childhood events meet that criteria.
Yep.
What we're really dealing with is a public health issue. It's not a mental health issue.
Right.
It's not just a sociocultural issue. It is a public health issue. If you have 2 or more adverse childhood events, you are 12 times more likely to have ischemic heart disease. If you have 6 or more, you're 12 times more likely to be an IV drug user. And the first portal of contact that children and families have is a doctor. And they're not asking those questions,
Right.
which is insane to us. If we know there is this set of data that will tell us you are far more likely to have cancer, we're not screening for that. And those individuals that are suffering most from that, again, I will say, do not look like me. So the work we're trying to do is we have serums, you know, you mentioned EMDR, you mentioned mindfulness. We have ways to treat trauma, but our delivery system, our syringe is broken. We have kids who are on probation, juvenile justice system, child welfare, mental health, and they don't speak to one another. And so part of our work at Trauma Transformed is, and we have a workforce that's dying trying to help these people because they're suffering their own traumatic stress. So what we do is we work with systems, and we do a lot of social justice work. We believe if you're talking about trauma and you're not talking about race, you're not talking about trauma. So, you know, we don't compare and contrast the experience of a veteran, the experience of a child. It is all trauma once it hits the brain.
Right.
And so we really look at public awareness and we look at training everybody to start speaking the same language.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Clarissa, you want to talk about the neuroscience behind?
Sure. Well, first, I don't want to repeat a lot of the research that has become evident based on what they have shared. I wanted to say that I came onto mindfulness practices due to a series of traumatic events. I have a background in mental health. At the time that I dealt with a series of traumatic events that left me in extreme depression, not getting out from bed, and suicidal, I started thinking of my background in mental health and thinking, wow, you know, I have coping mechanisms. I have my mom, I have my sister. I had just lost my father. I went through a divorce. I lost my house, my job, everything all within 6 months. So it was pretty traumatic, and it took a couple years to get back on my feet. But based on what everyone else before me has been sharing, when you have a support system, you have coping mechanisms that unfortunately someone that has consistent adversities, consistent toxic stress that's just ongoing, they don't have those coping mechanisms. So when I was going through my experiences, I started seeking and researching and finding ways, and based on the background that I had, and I stumbled onto mindfulness, and I realized that that I wanted to focus also to piggyback on what everyone before me was saying. We're living in a time where there are 2 trends globally going on. So we have stress levels that are out of control, right? Some of us are dealing with manageable stress, tolerable, and others with complete toxic stress that just can't manage it, which is a huge percentage of the population, believe it or not. And then, but we're also living in a time of that's being referred to as the golden age of neuroscience. What we have learned about the thinking brain and how our brain works is completely revolutionary in the last 10 to 15 years, which goes to what Dale was alluding to and what the folks before me mentioned. Children, when they're dealing with a lot of adversity that's just ongoing. It's not temporary. Stress is good. Normal, healthy stress is necessary, right, for our development, for our growth, for learning. Normal stress. Let's say a child wants something, they don't get it, they cry, and then they learn certain skills that we all need to learn, that you don't always get what you want, right? That's normal. However, when there's neglect, abuse, insufficient food, that's different. Ongoing violence, and it's ongoing. It really takes a toll on the brain chemistry, on the developing brain, how it's developing. And what I usually teach people, and even at Dale's school with the children, most of them were dealing with that type of toxic stress, and the teachers want them to pay attention, but you don't cultivate those skills. You just can't tell people, students like that or children like that, pay attention. They can't. You have to teach people. You have to cultivate. Why? Because they're already lacking that foundation as their brains were developing. And as you were saying, when you lack that foundation, and we can think of the metaphor of the foundation of a house. If the foundation is cracked or it's weak, as learning continues to happen, there's going to be connections that are critical for the brain that were not formed. And there are 3 parts of the brain that I usually talk about, which are very important. We have our emotional brain, and then we have where memory and learning happens, which is the hippocampus, and then there's the prefrontal cortex, which is what differentiates us from all species, which is your clear thinking brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It's the smart brain. It's the boss. While children's brains are developing, like the prefrontal cortex continues to develop. It spikes through different stages in our life, unlike the emotional brain, which after 18 months, it's set. So if that foundation is weak, you can combat that with mindfulness training and other forms of support. However, that foundation will always be weak. However, the prefrontal cortex, which is your clear thinking brain, where executive functions, where you think where impulse control, emotional intelligence takes place, if you help children cultivate that area, they're at least able to regulate themselves. And that's what we did at Dale's school. We were teaching children, 3rd, 4th, 5th graders, and then 6th graders as well, how to cultivate that area, how to at least insert a little pause before reacting, before hitting another kid, before jumping from your seat, how to manage with stress because they have so much stress at home, how to manage with test-taking stress. And so I think that one of the things that we're lacking is that we give people or teachers or parents a lot of information, but we're not cultivating skills that people need in order to survive.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. David.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I may come at the issue a little bit differently than some of my panelists, whom I've learned so much from just in these few minutes. I'm a civil rights lawyer. Can't hear me?
Can you hear?
Is it on?
Is the mic on? Or switch mic. Why don't you switch mics?
Is the mute on? Let's try this. Is that better?
Yeah, much better. Yeah.
Thank you. I just got through yelling at a group of 1Ls, and I just couldn't stand the idea of doing that here. So I come at this issue a little differently than some of my fellow panelists. I'm a civil rights lawyer and a law professor. And it took me a while to learn of what most of you in this room probably already know. And much of the time when I talk about the issue of childhood trauma and urban environments, I spend most of my time talking about the problems and talking about the various dimensions in which the problem of exposure to complex trauma in particular expresses itself neurobiologically, psychologically, cognitively in the classroom, socially, and ultimately physiologically. I don't have to do that here. So what I'd prefer to do is to address what we do with this knowledge. And it's a knowledge of a problem that is not so clearly defined from my perspective. The problem is not necessarily that children suffer from trauma. That's a problem in any society. The children in the Oakland Hills suffer from trauma. Their parents suffer from trauma. Just like the children below MacArthur, the children in Millburn suffer from trauma, just like the children in Irvington suffer from trauma. But what distinguishes them is not just their race and their class, but specifically their place. So environments have a tremendous amount to do with the reproduction of traumatic experience. And so when we start characterizing the problem as complex trauma, vicarious trauma, the various ways that we talk about trauma, in the same way that we talk clinically and subclinically about pain, we risk missing some of the causal dimensions of the problem. So the causal dimensions of the problem, the reason that trauma is more concentrated, more severe, more acute, more chronic below MacArthur, in Irvington, in the West and the South Ward of Newark, is because of a set of structurally unequal conditions that have perpetuated poverty and inequality. And that's my work. So my work is primarily concerned with the perpetuation, the reproduction of structural inequality. Because I too see this as a public health issue. But the notion that we will merely treat these conditions as they arise on an individual basis seems to me short-sighted and wasteful and ultimately inefficient. If we mean what we say about equality, then we have to look much more deeply at the structures that reproduce inequality and see complex trauma, and PTSD in particular, as the symptomatology of this structural inequality. So for me, the problem that needs to be addressed breaks down into two sides. It's on the one hand, it's intervention. And I think most of what we're talking about so far are how do we create more effective interventions? Can we use mindfulness in certain settings? Which institutions are responsible for it? What kind of training is more adequate? How do we get funding for these kinds of things? How do we reach the most people at the lowest cost and produce the most effective results? And that's clearly the moral imperative. We have to do that. When people are suffering from trauma, you simply cannot allow them to suffer, especially when you recognize what kinds of lifelong debilitating consequences the experience of childhood trauma can mean. But by the same token, you don't want to turn intervention into a cottage industry on the backs of someone else's misery. You want to treat this as a public health condition like you would AIDS or Ebola or Zika, and you want to wipe it out. Nobody's children should have to suffer from chronic trauma. Nobody's children should have to learn how to manage the experience of chronic community violence. Nobody's children should have to spend the kind of time with cortisol and adrenaline levels racing through their system because their little bodies are adapting as the human organism was designed to adapt to conditions that in their world have become normal, but for the rest of us would be considered a horror. So prevention strikes me as a very important part of this conversation, the recognition that the problem is more than the experience of trauma, but the causation of trauma through the structures that reproduce inequality. And without going into a lot of detail about that, what I would say from a theoretical view is that we're not just blaming poverty, we're recognizing the differences in the institutions in the lives of children in Millburn compared to the institutions in the lives of children in the South Ward of Newark. And many of these are the exact same institutions. Often they're public institutions governed by public law, by state law, but they function very differently. Just to give you one example, we know in this room that one source of trauma is dislocation and removal. When people are suddenly forced to leave their homes and move to another neighborhood or rendered homeless, that creates family-wide trauma. It disrupts all the routines. It makes every single thing they do much more difficult to do. And it often introduces all kinds of new dangers which present their own new traumas. So eviction is actually a phenomenon of structural inequality which reproduces trauma. Well, if you live in Essex County, the Essex County court system has an eviction rate of 25%. That means if you are in the unfortunate position as a tenant to face eviction, there's a 25% chance that an eviction will be carried out against you. However, if you live in Bergen County and you face the same circumstances, the eviction rate is 8%. So you are 3 times more likely as a tenant facing eviction in Essex County to actually be evicted than in Bergen County, just a few miles away. What accounts for the difference? Institutional differences. Differences in the way that judges are trained about the available remedies. Differences in the way that courts, that housing courts and landlord-tenant in particular, have looked at the problem of eviction, have valued the importance of eviction on families, and have tried to come up with other kinds of arrangements in order to reduce the trauma, and just a wiser use of resources. We could do that in Essex County and thereby reduce a tremendous amount of structurally imposed trauma on the most vulnerable families in those same neighborhoods, but we haven't had the will to do that. So ultimately what I'm suggesting is that when we look at what we are required professionally to do by the problem, we are really asked from a prevention standpoint to figure out how to work better and smarter to reduce poverty and to reduce structural inequality institution by institution.
Great. Well, thank you all. Let's give the whole panel a round of applause, please. So there's a third piece that didn't hear as much about, which I spend time on, because I think we talked about the issue in the community. We talked about the systemic, kind of the long term, the short term. But one of the reasons that I came up with the term urban traumatic stress disorder is really the policy. One of the things that we don't talk about is that the policy is adding to the trauma and the stress and the systematic racism, if you will. We'll say it here. Because as this superintendent of New Brunswick, he's held accountable with test scores. Basically, let's take it out of academics. Let's sports. He's running a track team. So he's held accountable to be as good a track team as another district, yet half his team has broken legs. And he's evaluated based on that. So there's a policy base, and I want to hear from the panel, how do we change the policy? Because we can talk about systemic, but that's not going to happen in the short term, no matter what we do, no matter how we protest, no matter what we, who's in office. So what are the policy implications of this? Because there's some systemic problems in the policy.
So I want to believe that you're talking about policy on a global scale.
Right.
What I want to share with you is what I can do in my home, in my district, directly, and what we have started to do. So I'll try and make some connections. So when you talk about policy, for me, I know that we just instituted a strategic plan, and we had 6 major priorities. One of the priorities is health and wellness, and that's at the forefront. So we are building those structures now for our students to include mindfulness, other strategies. I just learned a lot just listening from the panelists, where I'm thinking I have to go back and refine, because they just said some stuff that's really, I'm having a little bit of cognitive dissonance inside. So if I get emotional, that's because of that. So even in our own system, there's some structural inequalities on how we do business with students. And what we started to do this year, let me just digress a little. In the education system, we always believe we know the solutions. We know the answers. We sit in rooms, we brainstorm, we come up with these suggestions, we go put it in play, and we've been doing this for many years, but it's really not working. And one variable that we never have in that equation is the student. Students are not part of committees, students are not part of strategies, students are not part of sitting with superintendents and principals to help develop what we're trying to accomplish for them. Their voice is not heard in this process. Right. If you take a look at major toy companies, they tinker, they put the toy in a room, they sit behind glass walls, and they watch how kids interact with those toys. They throw some of them out, and they find the one that everybody wants to get for Christmas, because they watched how the students interacted with those toys. We need to do the same thing in education. We need to have our students' voices. They need to tell us also. What's working and what's not working, what's valuable for them and what's not valuable, how to infuse curricular constructs for them that will enhance their learning. They're not part of this conversation at all. So I'm actually taking that now because usually when you need therapy, you need to go talk to someone, right? So our kids need to talk to someone. So we have this year created a campaign where our student voices are part of all the conversations. We're developing their voice and we're also developing their agency. So they're not a victim of someone else's circumstances. They now know, as you stated, the tools to work around it, how to develop a habit of mind. So those are some of the things that I know that we're working on in our district. I don't want to share too much because he is a board president, but just to hear them, recently we went into the high school and we recorded about 7 students and asked them 2 questions. What does the park assessment mean to you? And why do you take the park assessment? And I was dumbfounded at the responses. They didn't understand the value of the assessments, and they believed they were taking the test for the teacher, which means to me that when they're taking these assessments, they really don't care because there's no connection for them, so they're just hitting anything, and yet I have to answer to the board president when those scores, right? But just hearing that, I don't have to say anything to teachers now. That's the product of our work. And what strategies are we going to do now, because that's their voices. When you hear from kids and you involve them, I want to truly believe things will start to change.
Great, thank you. Other comments? Yep. Matthew.
I hate microphones. You know, I think policy is, it's a difficult question. You know, we work a little with Dr. Howard Penderhughes, who's from Berkeley, and he looks at exactly what Dr. Trout was talking about, which is the idea that policy has to target these 3 areas when you're looking at trauma in particular, or traumatic stress. It is relationships within communities, it is opportunity, and it is place, right? So what things look like. And so what we look at, if we just take the mental health system as an example, mental health as a fundamental institution, like you were talking about, was not actually designed to help the people we're trying to help. So there is an inherent distrust of public systems on the part of people in urban environments that is justifiable and that is survival-based. Because the real intent of whether it be juvenile justice or mental health or other systems was not necessarily to lift up, it was to separate. So when we look at policy, we look at the lack of involvement of the very people we're trying to serve in solutions. And so it's one thing to say, which is very popular within systems, well, we want to be consumer driven. We want to involve consumers. Yet when you go and we do this, we partner with the 7 Bay Area counties and we talk about how are you involving the people you serve. And they have no discernible policy around how they do that. And so, you know, what we talk about is we bring awareness to the fact that adversity is at the heart of what most systems are seeing. If you want to call it trauma, you want to call it adversity within school systems or mental health. And also talking about you have to have policies that inherently drive the work that you're doing. So if your system, whether it be county or CBO, doesn't have a specific policy that overtly states we're targeting inequity and we're targeting trauma, you will not target inequity and you will not target trauma. Right. You will just repeat the narrative of your system. Right. And the narrative of the juvenile justice system is our intervention is to lock up. And the narrative of the mental health system is our narrative is to pathologize behavior. Yeah. And so it is not an easy answer, but what we find is what sustains true change is, unfortunately or fortunately, policy. Right? And so, and I've learned through sitting and talking to the behavioral health or mental health commissions that we should not wait for government to do it because they do not understand the depth of the problem at all. So we do it at a community level, but to do that, we have to recognize, as Dr. Trout put it far better than I ever could, is that we're dealing with an institutional problem.
Right.
And we're trying to use those institutions to fix it.
Yep.
It's complex.
Great. Well, thank you. Kristen, do you want to say anything about, some more detail about trauma and Prudential and what you do?
Sure. So, I mean, our major policy, I think, from behavioral health and wellness is, number one is to get rid of the stigma. Mm-hmm. So knowing that so many people, not just, we discussed veterans before, now we're discussing children growing up with trauma, that it is so prevalent, and people are coming to the workforce with all these, invisible wounds. How do we deal with them? So we do a lot of outreach to the human resources, to the management, to get rid of that stigma. If you notice that something is up or something's a little different, reach out to us. We know that we hit the mark when a HRC is reaching out to us and saying to our behavioral health consultant, I don't know what's going on, something has changed with this employee, maybe you can reach out and see. So how we do it, and we have a very collaborative approach, behavioral health will reach out to them, see if they're open to talking, and sometimes it's just they need some counseling. Sometimes they need to be referred to some resources. We give resources for child care. We provide resources for adult care, because a lot of people are taking care of their adult and family members. There's a lot of ways that we can support them. Or sometimes they are in such a crisis that Heidi will come to me and say, Kirsten, I think this person needs to go out of work and get appropriate behavioral health care. And then we sort of counsel them and help them go out of the work, get under appropriate care. Because we're medical, we can discuss with the providers, ensure that they're getting the right care, and ensure that they're engaged in a plan of care that allows them to return to work and be successful. So what we don't want is that these people with trauma that, are in our workforce, and, we just don't want them to implode. We want them to stay healthy. Ideally, we're getting them before they need to go out, or, before there's, a big issue. And we can get them the resources they need at that moment. But that's sort of, our idea, is that we just know it is a complex issue. We are not where we can set policies where we can change what's happening to the children, but we do know that they're going to grow up and they're going to join our workforce, and we want them to be successful.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, David.
If I was going to speak to the policy question.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So it really is an enormous question. We could spend all day on it, and we probably should. But let me just offer a few guideposts. I think first and foremost, part of what demystifies the policy question is to ask where we want to be, and to ask where people themselves want to be.
Right.
And I think when you ask them, and it's incredibly important that you ask them, that they tend to say a lot of the things that we ourselves would say, that they want the pain to stop, that they want the setbacks to stop, that they want to be heard, they want an opportunity to really express themselves in a meaningful way, where they don't feel as though they only have limited ways to do it and they're stuck inside someone else's box. And then to figure out how they can express their agency in the world, because they want material comfort, they want stability, they want safety. So if we begin sort of with the ideal, which is a common ideal for all of us, then we can work backwards from, well, what's missing and how do we get that? And isn't trauma the sort of introduction along the way, the interruption along the way of achieving each of those goals, often in horrific interruptions? Right. So I mentioned that it's important to look at institutions. It's certainly important to look at institutions. But when we look at the court system, for instance, it's amazing how much of the interventions that we might make to, as a matter of policy, to change the institutions that often compound traumatic experience in people's lives really just have to do with enforcing rules, right? What is happening in Bergen County is what should happen, and it's much more of a middle-class model. What is in Bergen County housing courts? What is happening in Bergen County schools to kids who are experiencing depression is probably what should happen. What is happening in many schools in Newark, in Irvington, in East Orange, in Orange, what is happening in the Essex County Courthouse is really not what should happen. It is not allowing people an opportunity to be heard. It is not recognizing their needs for stability. It is not treating them like full human beings. And oftentimes, it is not even following the law, right? So a lot of what we can do by way of policy is to enforce what we already have.
Correct.
Another way to get at it, though, is to recognize that there's a cumulative price to have been paid. If trauma is, especially intense trauma, is, as I suggest, the symptomatology of embedded structural inequality, it's not going to go away with superficial fixes. We're going to have to recognize that people are in a different place as a result of those experiences. And there's evidence out there that they're in intergenerational, epistemically different places as a result of traumatic experiences, patterns of traumatic experiences over the histories of their families. So we have to recognize that they have special needs too. And then this gets us into really one of the most difficult areas of policy making, it seems to me. And that is that not just the therapeutic community can pathologize folks. So this is why we get back to race, right? And this is why we get back to stereotype. And the notion that people who act out their traumas in particular ways are acting out things about themselves that we have thought were inherently true of their people for a long time. They are broken. They are broken and inadequate people, and there's very little that we can ever hope to do. And I think I hear some of this when people say, you know, what policy can we do? I mean, come on, what are we going to end policy? Well, we're going to end poverty tomorrow? Well, we're not going to end poverty tomorrow. As I suggested, we're going to go after the manifestations of poverty in people's psychological and physiological lives, institution by institution. But we're also going to have to check ourselves and to see the extent to which our institutional norms, our institutional rules, the way we talk about people privately, the way we manufacture even the day-to-day policies are not reflective of profound stereotypes that continue to subordinate people so that their trauma is normal.
Well, thank you. So I want to talk a little more about adults. And as you heard, Prudential is one of our major sponsors, Alpha STEM, DAV, and SOS is another sponsor, but also PTSDJournal. And I'll give my own little plug. On page 55, I have an article talking about, and yeah, please give Vic Nichols and Christian Benedetto, the co-founders of PTSD, credit. And so in that, I wanted to talk about this, because David, I believe very much with what you're saying, but I guess I see so much pain right now that I think we need to kind of address some of it. And so I talk about the interaction between police and citizens from a trauma standpoint, from an urban traumatic stress disorder standpoint, because that interaction is really based on, and so again, my book is on influence, and we're all products are influence. Everything is influence. Culture is influence. Racial perspectives are influence. And so when you have interaction, it's all based on your prior influences. So when we talk about that, one of the things that you find, I talk about mindfulness in police departments. So I'm going to ask Clarissa to talk about what you've learned about mindfulness in police departments.
Absolutely. Actually, there's
You want to
trend picking up. Sure. Let me just move this. There's a trend of mindfulness. That's too loud. There's a trend of mindfulness in a lot of police forces throughout the nation, actually. And it goes back to this brain science. So going back to a little bit to what we were just talking about, this brain science is not only behind the lack of being able to learn and control your emotions, it affects your physical health and mental health, as we've been speaking. So when you think of a profession like law enforcement, which is obviously a very stressful and one of the top most stressful careers out there, these police officers are learning how to regulate their emotions, how to insert a pause and not be so reactive, because a lot of the issues that and a lot of race issues that have been going on, a lot of times are attributed to the fact that they're so stressed and acting out of impulse, not being able to insert a pause and think and make a rational decision, instead just react. So we're seeing a trend, and it's going to be slow, and there's still research being conducted on how it's helping police officers, but we're seeing more and more law enforcement departments open to the practice because of the brain science behind it, of regulating your emotions, coping mechanisms, and building resilience, which is the same thing that we're doing with the children. It really goes to the bottom of all of this, is like, how do we become resilient? How do you cultivate that?
Excellent. And as we talk about it, and I mentioned in the previous panel mindfulness, and we'll talk in the next one about mindfulness, and I learned something, the eye movement, which is fascinating. And so we don't talk enough about, and part of the problem is that we've not recognized this as a medical condition. And I think that, even if you look at healthcare, and so again, I keep talking about influence, but you look at things like the prison system or the court system, and you look at influence, you look at the economic influence and what people have. And so you start pulling all that together, you start to see this pattern of really neglect of the community that is not middle class and majority. And so as we look at that, and as we talk about some of the changes, any thoughts on how do we go forward? What frustrates me is everybody seems to know this. I talk about trauma in urban communities. I talk about, classism and racism and other things, and everybody seems to know it, but nobody's doing anything about it. So how do we deal with, and trauma is at the heart of the problem, how do we deal with that, not just at the grassroots level, but really at the policy level? What role do we play in really trying to move that forward? That's you.
I think it's a question of who you're talking to, and it's a question of your area, your sphere of influence. So I do a lot of consulting with schools, and I think if you look at education, for example, education, being a teacher, you have very little autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So you continuously have, being a principal, you have very little autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have many mandates, many expectations that are often always changing. And you're managing a class, and you recognize that kids are struggling. But at the core of that is still a lack of understanding of the things that we've been talking about here, and being provided the resources to understand the kids that you're working with, right? Mm-hmm. If you talk about mental health, again, it's the idea that mental health tends to be driven that we have interventions that are very successful, but oftentimes we don't deem an intervention successful till academia tells us it's successful.
Right.
Meanwhile, there are people dying or people suffering.
Yep.
And we also realize that, I live way up north in Northern California, and I work in Oakland, and I'm surrounded by Native populations. Mm-hmm. Now, they have ways of dealing with trauma that are inherently effective. And they don't necessarily need a university professor and an N sample of 2,000 to tell them that's effective. Mm-hmm. And we, as practitioners who may have been trained in a traditional system, need to understand that some of those tools are effective as well, mm-hmm. right? So I do think there's this balance between a recognition that policy and getting at the roots of the problem, which are institutional inequities, has to be part of the discussion, mm-hmm. but also I think there's a reality that exists within systems that are helping people with trauma, that many of the individuals who are serving kids, families, veterans, they themselves don't understand mm-hmm. the neurobiology of
mm-hmm.
trauma.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't been trained in evidence-based practices. I mean, there's the assumption that they are. They're not. And so I think if we just think about it as awareness, I think that's where we have to start with our policy. Everybody knows it's a problem. Mm-hmm. I don't think people know the minutia of the problem, which is necessary to effectively intervene.
Yeah. Well, one of the things too, and again, you've got me thinking a lot about different things. But one of the things, and kind of building on what Dr. Johnson, Matthew, and what you said is, my background's in management consulting, so I look at things as a consultant. And you look structurally in the United States, we've been a top-down system, where you have a few, largely guys, sitting in a room making decisions about what music we listen to, what the policy is, and so what apps have done is created what I call a people, not bottom-up, but a people-up system. You don't develop an app and say, this is your app, take it or leave it. And so what we're talking about systemically, and what we're talking about, and we talked about with the schools, what you're doing with, I love the way you talk to kids. And so we need to do that with adults as well. But that leads to some of the systematic problems because people who don't understand the community are making those decisions. So any thoughts as we look at that, and that causes the trauma. Right. That causes the trauma. I mean, it drives me crazy that people will say, we're going to give scholarships to the kids in Newark, and are surprised when kids don't take advantage of college scholarships because they don't know anybody that's gotten value from college scholarships. So how do we kind of change this people-up system? We talked about how to do it in the schools, but in the community, in society, in housing authorities, et cetera, et cetera. Any thoughts on that as we close? David? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that it does go to awareness. We need to cultivate this awareness, which is part of the definition of mindfulness, right? Awareness. And a lot of what I do when it's in corporate settings, we try to analyze what's behind a lot of our judgments and our unconscious bias. And a lot of people have a lot of bias against self-care. Like, it's just not accepted. We've taken for granted that we live in a very stressful society, and we think that we should wear stress as a badge of honor. And a lot of times, if you show any signs of weakness, you're going to think that you're going to be stereotyped or stigmatized. So I think there needs to be a lot of education around awareness that it's okay to take care of yourself, and that's a lot of what I do with in corporate settings.
Excellent, David.
I think I don't have an answer except I have some warnings. The first warning, I'll repeat, is we really have to watch out that those of us lucky to be above it all, helping to make some of these decisions, don't fall prey to the kind of sort of systematic managerial thinking that demands that we categorize these things, that we label them correctly, and then execute from there. Because that, I think, is a direct route to pathology, to pathologizing people. And so the first warning is that we not pathologize people. The second warning is that we really struggle with whether or not we want to think about this as disability, because that is perhaps the most appealing, most defensible way to kind of categorize these experiences. It fits within a medical model. It creates sort of ready-made resource allocation. It's defensible on civil rights grounds. It appears to be exactly the right way to go, and we don't have to reinvent the structure in order to do it. So philosophically, while it may feel good, practically it may very well facilitate pathologizing folks, because not all disabilities are created equal. And not all disabilities, even the same disabilities, are treated equally in different places. So when I looked at this issue of childhood trauma, for instance, I started with kids, not because I didn't recognize their parents didn't suffer from PTSD, or their uncles or their aunts, and certainly not their incarcerated relatives, but that in this country, we had to begin from an innocence before if we were going to talk about the poor, because the poor are already pathologized as being the authors of their own fate. So to look at children allowed me to at least push aside some of that resistance and get to these fundamentally human reactions to environmental changes. This is what people do. You put people in these kinds of, this is what they do. They do it in Syria, they do it in the Sudan, they do it all over the world, right? You put people in horrific situations, their brains react the same way, they do the same kinds of things. This is our humanity acting out. But in this country, the way the institutional labels work, for instance, in special ed, creates an enormous risk that while trying to do well by these kids, at a structural level, we may wind up pathologizing them even further. So I don't have an answer yet. I'm really struggling with this myself.
As we are.
But I suggest we beware those things that seem most right, because we've been down that path before. And it is the road of unintended consequences.
Well, we're at time, and so just amazing discussion and some real kind of thought. But I hope I'm thinking a lot about this discussion. I hope you are as well. So let's give our panel a round of applause, please. And as I mentioned, just thank you so much to our sponsors. So before we break for lunch, we want to show a video, and we want to introduce the folks who really were the heart and soul behind PTSDJournal, and part of the group of the team, the brains behind this conference. I'm going to recognize some other people a little later. So Thank you all very much, and why don't we show the video?
Somebody with PTSD looks like your mother, your father, your uncle, your cousin, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your neighbor. You can't usually recognize right away.